if the probability around the year 2000 is set to 100, according to predictions by the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. Using these predictions, it's possible to predict that at the end of the century, the likelihood of having this 11 cities tour in a winter will be reduced by 80%. So that's an aspect of climate change, or an effect of climate change, of which many Dutch inhabitants are aware and that they are feeling more or less personally. And then there's another possible consequence of climate change that we are acutely aware of, which is that if sea levels continue to rise, then there is this possibility that large parts of the country become inundated if we don't protect ourselves against it. Because the Netherlands is below sea level, at least half the country is below sea level, particularly the area that is most densely inhabited with the largest cities. Rotterdam is not indicated on this map, but Rotterdam is actually around here, which will disappear from the earth when sea levels would continue to rise. And in the Netherlands we are very much aware of these risks because only recently we've had a very large flood. In the year in which I was born, in 1953, we had an enormous flood disaster that caused inundations of large parts of the southwestern Netherlands. The grey areas here, including areas immediately to the south of Rotterdam, were all inundated by this flood. This is a picture of a dike that has been broken during this flood, causing the land behind the dike to be completely inundated. And this is a picture of the Queen visiting these disaster areas immediately after the flood. And this is still very much present in our collective memory. Around 1,700 people in that part of the country died as a consequence of the flood disaster. Another consequence of this flood disaster was that we then reviewed the strength of the dikes in the country and decided to make huge investments to raise the level of the dikes and to increase the network of dikes, particularly in the southwestern part of the country. The so-called delta works were then implemented, which took around 30 years before they were completed. And when it became clear that the sea level would continue to rise during the 21st century as a consequence of climate change, the Dutch government decided to install a new Delta Commission, which actually reported last year about the necessity to further strengthen our dikes to protect ourselves against rising sea waters. This Delta Commission, chaired by former Minister Veerman, who is seen here while he presented the results of his commission, reviewed the predictions for sea level rise during the 21st century, and they actually constructed the worst case, the worst possible case, in which the sea levels in front of the Dutch coast would increase by 1.5 meters. That would really necessitate large infrastructural works to protect ourselves against the water. And in addition to the possibility of further sea rise, there is a second reason why it was necessary to review the policy with regard to the height and the strength of dikes, which is that the original delta works were based on certain estimates of the damage that would be done when floods would occur. The level of the dikes has been determined by calculations that would allow the dikes to be overflown at a maximum frequency of once every 10,000 years. That was the safety level that was chosen for determining the height of the dikes that we currently have. And that safety level was directly derived from cost-benefit calculations, in which the economic value of the land that would be inundated was taken into account. But since 1953, the point in time when we had this large flood disaster, the economic value of the threatened area has increased enormously. And this had been taken into account by this new Delta Commission, which has argued that the safety norms should actually be increased by a factor 10. And the combination of the two, this serious risk of a substantial rise in the sea level, together with the rise of the economic value of the threatened area, has led to these new plans, plans for protection against inundation that this Commission has proposed, and that will require a new law and a new fund on which around €1 million per year will have to be spent between now and the end of the century to achieve complete protection according to the recommendations of this Commission. Now, these are a few remarks as a general introduction to how the Netherlands relates to climate change, a reduced frequency of skating tours and enormous investments in the height of our dikes. But then there is the issue of health as a possible consequence of climate change. And here too, the awareness in the Dutch population and among Dutch policymakers of the implications of climate change has increased very rapidly over the last years as a consequence of a number of events and developments. And one event that has stimulated awareness of climate change and its consequences for health has been a very severe heat wave in 2003 that has killed thousands of people in the Netherlands and even more people in other European countries. This has acted as a very strong stimulus to think about the possible consequences of further climate change, but so have a number of policy reports, particularly from international agencies. The European Union is often ahead of national governments in recognizing new policy challenges, and the European Union has, over the past 5 years, issued various reports highlighting the possible health effects of climate change, and it has influenced the Dutch government also in becoming more aware of these consequences. And similarly, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in its last report of 2007, has been influential, as has the World Health Organization, which passed a resolution in 2008 mentioning the health consequences of climate change as one of the most important challenges, most important struggles for the public health sector in the coming years. And as the awareness of the health consequences of climate change has increased, the Dutch government decided to have a review on what these consequences could be for the Netherlands. And I will report on these, the conclusions of this report. That was a joint effort of 2 universities and 2 public agencies focusing on public health and environmental protection in the Netherlands. In this report, we reviewed the potential consequences of climate change and other global environmental changes for population health in the Netherlands between now and the year 2030. We decided to focus on these first decades because there is more certainty about the health consequences in that period. But we also spent a little bit of thinking about what the consequences would be in a larger time frame, a longer time frame. But the most parts of the report are devoted to the decades between now and 2030. And we considered both direct and indirect effects of climate change. Climate change can have a direct impact on human health through physico-geographical factors directly linked to climate change, not only exposure to higher temperatures of the population, but also changing wind patterns, for example, and rising seawater. Those could all affect human health in a more or less direct fashion, but there can also be important indirect effects when climate change induces changes in natural systems, for example, in the distribution of infectious disease agents.